Okay, so with that, I will welcome Dr. Brendan Cowled from Ausvet, who's going to talk to us today about what role feral pigs may play in the transmission and control of foot and mouth disease in Australia. So Brendan has provided a video of his presentation as he's just come down with COVID. So thanks, Narelle.
Thanks for your attention. Thanks for the invitation today to talk, Heather. Today I'm going to talk about foot and mouth disease in feral pigs and modelling that we did a few years ago now, but we spent about 10 years looking at this. I do apologise today that I'm presenting this as a recorded presentation. It's Tuesday when you're watching this, but I got COVID on Monday morning, and so my son came home with it last week, so I apologise for the recorded nature of this, but I hope to be around for questions after this talk. So the objective today is to really look at how feral pigs may interact with FMD out there in a pastoral setting. This is in Northern Australia, but we wanted to look at how they interact both on their own and with cattle, because you can't really look at these species on their own, feral pigs, because they're often so close, cheek by jowl with other species like other ruminants, and they're all contributing to how foot and mouth disease may transmit. So I guess we want to look at how they'll interact, and then what should we do about it? Should we get involved with doing something about feral pigs during an outbreak, or should we concentrate on cattle, or should we concentrate on both? So that's really the question we're looking at here. Not particularly the control tool that we should necessarily use, because helicopter shooting or baiting or trapping or ground baiting, they all have different benefits and advantages and disadvantages, but we're just concentrating on strategic decisions here about whether we should get involved with feral pigs or not. First, a bit of background, I guess. First, a bit about my background, to give you confidence, not as a claim to any great knowledge necessarily. I spent probably almost 10 years working on feral pigs full time. Started the invasive animal CRC, where we did a lot of bait research. I identified sodium nitrite as a new toxin for pigs, for example. Did a lot of ecology. Then I spent 5 or 6 years doing disease modelling. A lot of work in the out there, cutting out pigs and trapping them. A lot of work spent behind a computer doing disease modelling too, of course. But now I'm a veterinary epidemiologist, where I do a lot of disease research in various species. But I guess that's my background. Now, feral pigs, I assume you know about feral pigs. I won't go into that. Apologies if you don't know about them, but that might be the wrong forum. FMD, I thought I'd describe FMD a little. Some people may not have a great background in FMD. It's a viral disease. It's extremely infectious. It's one of the most extremely infectious diseases out there. It doesn't always kill animals. Sometimes it just makes them sick and you get a production drop. Depends on their age and their industry. Like dairy industry, it'll kill a lot of animals and huge milk drop. But if you're in a feedlot, you might get a month's production loss and maybe nothing else. But it's a very high morbidity, very low mortality disease, really. But it's a very important trade disease. So most of the developed world's eradicated this disease, and we trade with high value overseas developed markets. And so as soon as we got an outbreak, we would then have a trade disruption. And we do export about 20 billion in livestock livestock products a year. And so that would be immediately disrupted. So that's, what's that? Divided by 50 weeks, that's 300 to 500 million a week probably. And so that's immediately the impact. We may be able to do some zoning, probably eventually eradicate disease and get trade back, but in the meantime we're losing that hundreds of millions a week. So this is a major reason why outbreaks have been estimated to cost billions if they hit. Control costs would also be high. There's a lot of culling involved. Whilst there's a vaccine for foot and mouth disease, it wouldn't always be used. It wouldn't be used in remote pastoral areas very often. It'd be saved and used judiciously down south, where there might be piggeries or feedlots with very high density of animals in sort of built up areas where you can't just go through and kill and cull to control the disease. But it does complicate freedom from disease, because nearly all the animals that were vaccinated would probably have to be culled to get freedom and regain our trade. So it's a complex thing. Now, as to what people think will happen with FMD and feral pigs, there's been a lot of worry and concern about this for a very long time, and people are right to be worried. FMD is such a devastating disease that if feral pigs are involved, it's important to deal with them. There's been some extra concern about FMD and feral pigs because of some old research, for example, some old modelling. Roger Peck and John McElroy did some work on FMD and showed that it would spread in a contiguous way, about 3 k's per day across the landscape, and that's quite scary for people. I guess I'd note that that's simplistic modelling with sort of pretty simple mathematical modelling, and those guys did a very good time in the 90s when they did that in the 80s. Computers weren't highly available, the technology was poor, and they did a good job with the tools they had, but that sort of approach has generated a lot of fear over the years. It's likely that the impact and role of feral pigs may have been exaggerated to some extent, but with extra modern tools, we can have another look at it, and that's what we did in our approach. So I have a bit of a look at this now with our modelling. We did this 30 years later. We had modern modelling tools, we had newer computers, everything works better than what Roger Peck and John McElroy did, so hats off to you fellas doing this with the slide rule. But we can now look at it with very modern approaches, simulation modelling. We can look at spatial locations, where pigs are across the landscape. We can look at their ecology and their behaviour. We can look at how they interact with pigs and cattle, and we can be just more detailed about it. So we did this, and we did it in the Kimberley in Western Australia, and that's where our research occurred. So now I'd like to talk about the method we used to do our modelling. I guess the first thing we did was to simulate populations. We looked at 6 pastoral leases in the Kimberley. It's just 6 farms, but that's 10,000 square k's. We did aerial surveys, so we looked at the densities of cattle, we looked at the densities of pigs, we talked to the producers, we did surveys of producers, biosecurity officers, we shot pigs up there for a couple of years. We looked at how they manage their cattle normally. We looked at the normal feral pig biology from years of work in the Kimberley, and also from the literature. We looked at FMD and pig behaviour. So how would pigs behave with FMD? We looked at expert judgment here, and I take my hat off to Graham Garner, the co-author on this work. Graham spent 30 years, 40 years mouth disease in Australia, and so he really knows his stuff, so he was a great help with expert judgment. We looked at literature, we just looked at what FMD might do, and then we modelled this in Ausvet. It's a national FMD model at DAF up until a couple of years ago. It was a regional model, and now it's been replaced by ADIS, but at the time this was Australia's national model. It's done in Visual Basic and within a geographical information system, and so now it's been changed to a much faster ADIS. So here's the location of our study. It's in the Kimberley in northwest Western Australia, as I said. It's along the Fitzroy River there, so it's really good cattle producing country, and lots of cattle there, and so that's the location of our study site overall. And here's a distribution of feral pigs in the area. So each one of those red sort of shapes is a paddock on one of the leases. The red paddocks are sort of funny, regular shape up in the north east of the study area because we didn't have locations of paddocks there, so we simulated them on grids. The blue lines are rivers, the black dots are feral pig mobs, so we based that on the density of known pigs, the aerial surveys, talking to people, and the size of pig populations and pig mobs that should be up there. And so that's a distribution of pigs. And here we have the distribution of cattle. There's many, many more cattle in that area than there are pigs. So they're pig groups. There's about 80,000 cattle, and the previous slide of pigs is about 1,000 to 2,000 pigs. So pigs are 1 to 2 per square kilometre. Cattle are way, way more dense. So there's a lot more of them. And here's a typical simulation of an outbreak. And so this just shows one model run. There's many hundreds of thousands of these simulations. You can see those grey dots in the background of the pigs. The sort of orangey dots in the background are cattle herds. They're all susceptible. They haven't been infected yet. And the red and the blue are the infected cattle populations. There's a couple of infected pigs there, but that's the sort of picture we're seeing. It's spreading out from a location. We tended to introduce this to feral pig herds and then watch it spill across into cattle, because that's the way we thought it would most likely spread into the populations up there. Generally, it started in a pig, at maybe around Fitzroy Crossing, where there might be tourists, and then it would then spread to cattle from there. So that's a typical simulation there. So this is the first sort of results from the modelling. It's a table and it summarises things pretty well. I won't go into many more results than these. So if you look at each one of those columns, the column on the left is just the metric, the parameter we're measuring. But the next three columns, pigs only, cattle only, and cattle and pigs, refer to whether or not we're controlling just pigs or just cattle and pigs. Once diagnosis occurred, we get in there and did we cull cattle only, or do we get the chopper up and shoot pigs only, or do we do cattle and pigs, for example? So that's a control strategy. And that's what we're looking at here, how important are pigs? Should we be looking at pigs or not? And you can see that first row there, probability of eradication. If you run your eyes across the columns, you'll see probability of eradication for pigs is 61%. That means that if you just control pigs in the area where there's a foot and mouth outbreak, it'll lead to disease fade out and eradication of FMD instead of times. If you controlled it just cattle, if you just culled cattle and put movement restrictions for cattle, you get 100% control. So disease would die out all the time if you just controlled cattle. If you did cattle and pigs, of course, you also get 100% control. The next row, time to eradication, here we're talking about how many days it takes to eradicate, is way quicker if you look at cattle. So if you concentrate on cattle, it's gone in 49 days. If you concentrate on cattle and pigs, it's gone in 42 days. And that doesn't seem like much, but it's a pretty significant difference, 7 days. And we talked about before that we export 20 billion a year, and so that's several $100 million saved because you eradicated a week earlier. So that shows that cattle are driving this, and you've got to control it in cattle most importantly, but you should also look at pigs. If you just control pigs, the times where we could eradicate it from the population in general up there, cattle and pigs, you took 111 days to eradicate it. So you should never really just look at pigs only. So the control area, we're talking about a few hundred square k's here, and we're assuming that on day 30 we detect this. So it's introduced, day 30 we detect it, and so you're taking quite a while to control it. It's spread quite a way by the time you get on top of this. The number of cattle herds culled, or the number of cattle, if you actually control pigs as well, and you only got to knock off 20 or 30 pig herds around the infected area, you can actually save having to cull, 1,000 cattle. So even financially, it's probably worthwhile culling pigs as well. But the take-home message from this table is that cattle, you must control cattle. If you control it in cattle, it'll always die out. If you control it only in pigs, it'll never die out. If you control it in cattle and pigs, it'll be slightly faster and slightly smaller outbreaks if you concentrate on pigs as well. So it's worth doing cattle and pigs, but cattle has to be done. It'll still die out if you don't control pigs, but the outbreaks will be larger. So I guess the conclusion of all that modelling, years of work really, was that cattle are more important. Their density is way higher, so there's 80,000 cattle in that area and 1,000 to 2,000 pigs. More dispersed. They have larger home ranges. They can walk from water 10 kilometres out to graze. Pigs can't do that. They overheat and die. They're muster very large distances, which spreads disease. And there's regular spillover to pigs. Like pigs might introduce this perhaps, but then there'll be mostly a one-way traffic of cattle to pigs, not the other way around. So they're a spillover host, really. Cattle are the reservoir. But I guess having said that, pigs are still important. Whilst we could eradicate disease without even touching a feral pig in this situation, it's relatively low density, 1 or 2 pigs per square K, but that's common across a lot of Australia, that sort of density. We could eradicate disease without touching a pig. But if you do pigs, then you get, a week earlier perhaps, and that's, several $100 million in exports from Oz. So they're still worth persisting in an outbreak. I think in an outbreak, you'd start working on cattle straight away with the movement standstill, and then you'd get your choppers up as well, and you'd shoot as many pigs as you could find. You'd do surveillance, and you'd cull around the infected area, and that would be, if you got 60 or 70% of these pigs taken out, then you'd make a big difference. I guess the other point I make is it's probably not useful to control feral pigs in advance of an outbreak for foot and mouth disease biosecurity reasons. So I guess we've shown here that cattle are the biggest contributor to the epidemiology of the disease in the region. If you reduce the number of pigs there, you're still going to have some pigs left. You can't eradicate them. There'll still be a proportion left, enough to start a disease outbreak probably. And so no matter how much culling you do, you're not going to reduce that risk of introducing the disease. And then it's mostly cattle that spread it anyway. So I think that we can't do this wholesale biosecurity control of pigs around the country. Probably you concentrate on excluding pigs in very risky areas like foot feedlots or piggeries, that sort of thing. But in these pastoral areas, yes, control pigs, but do it for agricultural protection or ecological biodiversity protection, but not to reduce the risk of foot and mouth disease outbreaks. It's interesting, I thought I'd just bring up some CSF modelling that we did a year or two earlier than this. We hadn't had the advantage of going out and doing aerial surveys. We didn't have quite as much information about density, but we modelled classical swine fever, which is a pig-only disease in the same pig population. And we found there that CSF was sustained in feral pigs for years. It went up and down waterways, watercourses. It just ticked along very slowly at, half a kilometre or a kilometre a day, maybe a bit less. And I guess the difference here is that there's a carrier state. So CSF, you can get a carrier pig which is, had infection and it's still walking around normally, yet it's still shedding disease. And that was the main difference. We had slightly higher density of pigs in our CSF study. That was, as I said, because we knew more by that time, but that may have had an impact, but it's probably mostly the biology of the disease. We found that we could control CSF with aerial shooting quite easily. So if you shot, 40, 50, 60% in quite a wide buffer around the population, it did lead to the outbreak dying out. So it's an interesting contrast. Papers there if you want to look it up. That's veterinary research. Before I finish, I thought I'd talk about Ausvet Plan. Ausvet Plan's nothing to do with Ausvet, where I'm from. It's written by Animal Health Australia or coordinated by Animal Health Australia. It's Australia's National Veterinary Emergency Plan. There's two really relevant chapters or plans that are good for this topic. Foot and mouth disease version, which is a generic one that talks about foot and mouth and how it would be dealt with if it came into Australia, irrespective of species. And there's a wild animal response version. And so the wild animal response version covers what would be done to, say, feral pigs. And so read together, they're a useful resource to know how veterinary authorities would deal with an FMD outbreak. So I guess that largely concludes my talk. That's a nice little scene from the Kimberley there, where at Smoko after doing a bit of post-morteming all day. I guess I'll throw it back to Heather now. But Heather will be available online, hopefully, for some questions. And before I go, I just acknowledge co-authors. These are particular acknowledgements for this particular project where we did the work in Kimberley doing this modelling and sampling, looking at disease transmission. There are a lot of players. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. Brendan, are you online?